I am John from Narcotic Casserole. I am the defender of fandoms, the enemy of trolls. See, out of anyone's mouth, that just doesn't sound right. Yes, I know I'm late on one, but when you think about the fact that I'm doing it alongside this one, it just kind of works. So, yes, I'm going to review both Luke Cage Season 2 and Iron Fist Season 2. I jumped on Luke Cage Season 2 when it aired and plowed right through it. And I just never got around to doing a review of it. And I realized, no, good timing, let's save it for when I review Iron Fist Season 2. And that's what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to try and be brief with Luke Cage Season 2 because odds are a lot of you guys watched it and all of you have already cultivated your opinions on it. I'm just doing this specifically so I can keep the continuity going with my reviews of Marvel Netflix shows. So, I'm going to try to bullet point this. First off, I'm definitely going to say Luke Cage Season 2 was a vast improvement over Season 1. For the simple fact, for those who remember my Less to More episode, I pointed this out, the latter half of Season 1 got weighed down severely because they switched villains. Cottonmouth was great, and you didn't mind watching him for the whole season, but as we know, he got killed, and then giving way to Diamondback. And Diamondback, while he was definitely an imposing physical threat, the main problem with him is that his motivations were embarrassingly weak. He was just a really vicious crime boss with severe daddy abandonment issues. Whoopee! For a great villain that does not make. Fortunately, some other villains from the first season get carried over to Season 2, and you actually get to see this horrifying progression. Of course, I'm talking about Shades and Mariah. And in the time from when we last saw them, you see them actually form this very demented relationship with each other. One in which that we see Shades just gradually admiring how horrifying Mariah is and how dangerous she's becoming. But then when it gets to the point where she starts doing things that even he can't condone, and the fact that he can't condone them, that tells you just how devious she has become. And she gets to a point where she is just slashing people's throats and setting people on fire. And you're just like, this is the same person who in episode 1 was building her up to be a paragon of the community. And it is an incredible development, and it's not erratic either. It's built up, and it becomes this tour de force performance for Alfre Woodard. And while I have a feeling she's not even going to be remotely looked at come award season, I bid you guys to do whatever you can to let people know this woman needs some kind of awards recognition for her performance in this season. And I will say, she was one of the most powerful elements to this story, especially when it came to her story with her daughter, and how that resolves is... But she is not the only player in this season. The other one, Bushmaster. I love a villain that you sympathize with. I like any villain who is not just evil for the sake of being evil, but the fact that he had become evil because of the machinations of others. And the whole idea that he's doing this because of a vendetta against Mariah and her family. And the main reason he has that for Luke is just as an intimidation tactic to show Mariah that he is not to be trifled with. That here's a person who is exceptionally brutal, who does horrible things in order to achieve his goals, but at the same time, you approve of his ends, but definitely not the means. To have a guy like Bushmaster being so brutal, to have essentially the same goal as Luke. Meanwhile, you've got Luke, who is pushing himself night and day to keep the streets of Harlem safe and to try and be the image of the hero of Harlem that he has cultivated for himself, only to find himself just consistently hitting walls, to be interfered with the police, to always be curtailed by due process, and always trying to keep himself the virtuous man that we know. And it finds him at odds with Misty a lot. You got him trying to achieve his goals, and ultimately, even though he does teeter on one side between doing it right and doing it harshly, it leaves him in a way that which had me shocked and had me going, bring on season 3, because I will say there are some pacing issues throughout this one. I definitely feel that Netflix should heavily consider shortening the seasons, and I think 13 may be an excessive run. The thing I really liked about The Defenders, and if you remember from my review, I love the 8-episode runtime. It made the story feel tighter. It felt that there wasn't any room for any fat. It kept the focus where it needed to. And that was great. And I like that they still took advantage of a stretched runtime and didn't have to feel like they had to rush into anything. But what they did have felt like it was mined for its peak potential. But I definitely feel that was elements that weighed down the previous Marvel seasons, The Punisher, Jessica Jones, and now this one. I feel 13 may just be a bit too long of a runtime. Now, this one, I feel the story did have some legs for 10, maybe 11 episodes, but I do think it may have been 2 episodes too long. And you get this feeling that they're doing it out of contractual obligation, and you're feeling that's not the way to go. Now, I'm not saying there was any extraneous subplots. The plots here all worked, but I felt like they could be tightened a bit more. And that's really my major note about that. And that's not a bad place for the season to be. And there was even room for a lot of the other fun little bits and bobs that Netflix decided to give us as a reward for being stalwart viewers. Early in the season, we get a crossover. Colleen Wing pops in to give Misty a pep talk to help her cope with the fact that she is now Sans right arm and is feeling a little low in herself. So there's a great episode where you get to, with this excellent bar brawl where they team up together. It's an absolute blast. And yeah, I, like everyone else, am waiting for that Daughters of the Dragon spinoff to happen. But another spinoff I know we're all waiting to happen, and the potential of it was hinted at in this season. Episode 10, Danny Rand shows up. Luke Cage and Iron Fist working together in one episode. The writing was spot on. We finally get to see Danny Rand as a bit more fun-spirited. We get to see him play off Luke. Iron Fist, while the potential for him is there, the stuff about him is interesting. The thing is, I don't feel that in the comics he reached his peak potential until he teamed up with Luke. I mean, let's face it, the thing that really defined the identity between these two characters was the friendship between them. This is one of the best bromances in comics history. Part of the fun of it is the fact that this is a friendship that, against all odds, works and is harmonious. You have the privileged white guy who, against all odds, became a kung fu master and is imbued with supernatural powers, teaming up with an ex-convict who's street cred, who is tough as nails, but also has a heart of gold. And the best part about that episode is that we actually get to see the potential right there, not just for Luke's character, but for Danny. And I lovingly dubbed the episode the Heroes for Hire pilot, and I hope that the positive reception that I know the episode has been getting is enough fuel on the fire in order to get the Heroes for Hire series that we all want. But all of this little stuff here, combined with a very compelling villain and also a stronger sense of pacing and a stronger story progression, definitely makes Luke Cage Season 2 a definite step up from Season 1, and I'm going to give it... Now, let's go to the black sheep of the Marvel Netflix lineup. Let's talk about...
I'm the immortal Iron Fist, weapon of Kunlun.
Oh, wait a minute, he doesn't say that at all throughout this season. In fact, other characters say it as a joke. Oh my god. If I didn't know better, this whole season, they actually paid attention to our thoughts, concerns, and Iron Fist Season 2 is actually a step up. It is a vast improvement over Season 1. Season 1 was a mess. It was, actually, I wouldn't even call it a mess. I would call it a slog. It was a slog. The writing was bad. The story was boring. I mean, the Hand were doing no favors, but then ultimately Harold Meacham was just a psychotic businessman. And all of that blame can be placed on Scott Buck. On one side, I'm really sad that Inhumans crashed and burned so bad, but I'm actually kind of glad it did, because when people found out that the same guy responsible for that atrocity is the same guy who ruined Iron Fist, I think it took a lot of heat off of Iron Fist, because people realized that it really truly was not the fault of Finn Jones, and it wasn't the fault of any actor or anything involved with the series. It was just bad decision making on the part of a mediocre showrunner. Most people also know him as the guy who killed Dexter, so yeah. We have a new showrunner, M. Raven Metzner, who has a lot of cred with comics. You can tell that more time was dedicated to improving the fight scenes. The scripts were tighter. They had a lot more wit. They had levels. There was humor. There was compelling drama. There was much stronger focus on character. And And because of the fact, another note that they seem to pay attention to is the fact that the season was tighter. It had 10 episodes. The pacing of the season benefited from it greatly. There was never a point in the season where I was like, okay, let's get through with this. I actually felt that it was just right. Now, even so, the one hitch with this season is that you felt like they were picking up a lot of the pieces from the mess that Scott Buck left behind, and a lot of stray plots that were left open from that season. You felt like they were obligated to include them in this season for the sake of resolution, and not just doing a forced write-off. Because then people would have said, like, I went through that whole mess and we're not actually going to address that yet. Here they actually did take the time to actually address it. And they do their best to tie it into the very compelling A story. And actually the great thing they do in the season is that they get rid of all the corporate bullshit and just focus on Danny actually strongly focused on his aims as the Iron Fist to actually do good. And it was really great to see Danny just really wanted to put himself out there to just be helpful and not bluster so much that he's the Iron Fist. It made Danny a much more appealing character to find him in this place where he just wants to get out there and do good. Danny actually kind of gets a bit of a thirst for this life, because you also get the vibe that he's becoming addicted to having the Iron Fist, and you kind of see him go off the rails very slightly. You see him teeter-totter into going overboard, and the only thing that kind of keeps him at bay is Colleen. And Colleen is still one of the best things about the show, and even more so, especially springboarding off that great episode she had in Luke Cage, we get to see more of her with Misty Knight, and some of the best, some of the funniest character interactions, and some of the most badass imagery we get to see all involves the two of them together. And again, give us that Daughters of the Dragon. Give it to us, damn it. But even more so, the thing I really liked about Colleen this season is that it was great to see where she kicked off, where she felt a sense of failure, despite her best efforts to get rid of Bakuto and purge herself of her torments of the past. Unfortunately, this came at a cost of permanently injuring Misty. She felt responsible for it, and it actually felt very nice to see her in a different position where she is still trying to do stuff for the community, but still feel the itch to know that her real talents are pretty much where Dandy is. And that really made for a great arc throughout the season with her. And it all resolves in a way I just didn't see coming, and I know a lot of comic fans are taking issue with it a bit, but at the same time though, I like seeing Colleen where we left her, and it makes for something more striking. And the fact that we get to see this arc with her in her interactions with Danny and her interactions with Misty, it's going to make for some incredible viewing, either for Iron Fist Season 3 or for whatever else Netflix has in store there. Now, as for Danny, now there have been some criticisms saying that he's kind of in the background in his own show. I strongly disagree with that. I feel that a lot of his arc actually juxtaposes very nicely with that of the main villain. Now, this villain was actually alluded to in the first season. It was actually developed. So we do have a good, strong springboard there. One of the few things strong for the first season is Davos, his surrogate brother from Kunlun. Here we actually find out a lot more about where he comes from and why he is so resentful towards Danny. And you find out that it's not just because of the falling out that they had at the end of season 1, but you find out that there is some deep-rooted resentment coming from the fact that he had been groomed all of his life, that he would be the one to take the mantle of the Iron Fist, only to have it taken from someone who was an outsider, and someone who, in the eyes of anyone who was born and raised in Kunlun, and it can be extremely humbling, and this is the kind of humbling that a character like Davos just really can't stand. Episode 2 really gets into it as to where all this acrimony grows from, and it all comes from this flashback fight sequence, which is just intense and is brutal all the way through, and it all comes down to whoever wins is going to be the one to face off against Shao-Lao and hopefully, ultimately, gain the powers of the Iron Fist. In that fight, you get to see the differences between the two, where Danny actually utilizes his wits to pacify and only utilize his gifts in order to subdue and not to cause any kind of actual, real, physical, permanent harm. Whereas you see Davos become much more ferocious, much more angry, much more driven, and almost deadly. And ultimately, in that fight, you get to see that he was never meant to wield the powers of the Iron Fist. Unfortunately, he gains the power and becomes the Steel Serpent. And ultimately, when you see what he does with it, you can easily see that it's not just about skill, and it's not just about grooming, and it's not just about where you're from. It's about who you are as a human being and what you would do when you're given power. Now, you see Danny being tempted by this power, but you ultimately see that because of the people he loves, because of where he's from, and because of his upbringing combined with that, you see that here's a person who has suffered through hardship and risen above it with the training he has received, and also with the friendships he has forged between Colleen, between Misty, between Luke Cage, between Matt Murdock, and all of them. You actually see him become more human. Really, I don't think that Danny was in the background for the season. I just felt that they positioned him on a juxtaposition with the villain in order to help us understand the motivation between these two. And there is a point in the season where Danny becomes extremely humbled, and what actually is very compelling is to see him still driven to rise up. In a way, it's kind of similar to Bruce Wayne in The Dark Knight Rises, where you saw him get humbled and you see him fight through serious hardship in order to rise again to become the man that he needs to be. And it all leads to an excellent resolution. And I'll say it again, I did not expect the season to end the way it did. Considering this all comes from a show that in the first season we were trashing it for some very glaring flaws, the fact that I'm here now actually really energized by everything that I saw in this season, it's a great place to end it, and I hope that it gets cleared for a season 3 because I actually am very excited for where they take it further. So this is a decided improvement, and yes, I'm going to tell you now, for all you action fans, the fight sequences, yeah, that's another thing that got stepped up significantly. Even though the season is 10 episodes, which means for a much tighter story, there are some elements to it which, not so much that they feel like padding, it feels like they're trying to clean up a lot of the mess left over from the first season. And this all, unfortunately, involves Ward and Joy Meacham. Like I said, you can't just write them out. You have to actually resolve their characters. Because of that, a lot of their involvement with this season just doesn't feel like it meshes well. Ward, they do some good stuff with him, but even then, Ward still has a lot of subplots, which definitely do to help build him as a character. But if there's any subplot that does feel like padding, it's a lot of his. Now, I'm not saying they're bad. Compared to the much more interesting A story, it's something that feels like over here. Joy does do a better job of integrating more with the A story, but even then, it's still hard for me to really get her modus operandi with this whole thing. I get why she's angry with Ward. He kept the secret that the father was still alive. But even then, she found out what a bastard her father turned out to be. And there's a scene where Ward lays out, like, yeah, I kept the secret that he's alive, but did you ever wonder why? Oh, yeah, it's because he was a monster. He was an absolutely horrible human being, and I wanted to spare you from that. I know it wasn't my decision to make, but I made the decision for your protection. And the fact that that doesn't just close the book on that right there, the fact that Joy still just seems to want to, let that hang. And I was like, come on, that should have ended it right there. He makes a strong point. And you saw the evidence of his bastardly behavior. So by extension, because of her involvement in that particular subplot, it also brings in a new character, which they try their best to really work her in with the A story, but ultimately she just feels like a very odd addition. Of course, I'm referring to Mary Walker, ultimately Typhoid Mary, played by Alice Eve. The thing that makes her infinitely watchable, first off, is that she's really well written. That's a perk, but also Alice Eve. Unfortunately, a lot of people only remember her knickers and completely ignore the fact she is a fantastic actress. She's made some great appearances in Men in Black 3 and also Black Mirror. She is wonderful in this. Actually, she's almost unrecognizable. And there's a very strong hint of a really interesting character here, but unfortunately, in the whole grand scheme of this season, she always tends to stick out like a sore thumb because you always feel like she doesn't really belong here. I'm kind of staggered that they brought her in on this one when really any comic fan knows that she is, in fact, a villain of Daredevil. So I'm kind of wondering why they didn't just wait to bring her in with Daredevil Season 3 or wherever else. But either way, it just would have been more interesting to bring her in on Daredevil. So while her presence is welcome, and I think a lot of it is elevated by Alice Eve's very strong, very disciplined performance, ultimately I just don't feel that she belonged here. I actually feel like more passion, more time, more dedication was put into making this a much stronger season. And it is a stronger season. It just has a lot of rickety joints left over from the mishandling of the first season. And it had to compensate for that. But you definitely felt by the end of this season that it's actually moving into some really exciting directions for the future. So I really hope Iron Fist gets renewed for a third season because of the potential that's really being set down at the end of this season. So I'm going to be extremely generous to it in lieu of the flaws I just said, and I'm going to give Iron Fist Season 2 Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think Luke Cage Season 2 was a drastic step down from the first season? Do you think Iron Fist Season 2 was, well, let's face it, it can only be a better opinion of the first season? Honestly, but was your opinion the same as mine? Leave it all in the comments below. And for more addictive content on Narcotic Casserole, simply like, share, subscribe, click. Thou shalt be served. Also, I want to throw this out for you guys. I'm going to be taking a couple of weeks off, specifically because I've got a lot of content which I have to prep for a certain month that's popping up in November. But to tide you over, I have already prepped a lot of content for the Halloween season. I've already done 4 episodes of Rare Delicacies. Each week we're going to be tackling different horror films. And we're going to have a special Halloween edition of the Cinema Schlock Society. But you won't have long to wait for another episode of Cinema Schlock. As I promised, our next edition will be Clash of the Turkeys, where we're going to pit Masters of the Universe versus G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra. So that will be coming out in the weeks to come. I just wanted to let you guys know if there's like a week where you're like, hey, how come there's nothing on Narcotic Casserole? So that's why. So we got a lot of plans for the future, but I also need to take a step back and go, ugh, I'm exhausted. So there. So thank you guys for your continuing watching. Find us on Twitter. Find us on Instagram. Find us on Stardust. All there. But thank you so much, and see you when I see you.